You've been measuring the Buddha with the wrong ruler. When the Buddha talks about the three kinds of fabrication, bodily, verbal, and mental, he does it in two contexts. One is in the context of describing how different actions lead to different levels of rebirth. In other words, fabrication on a macro level. He says that if you fabricate an injurious bodily, verbal, or mental fabrication, then whether you're alert to it or not, in other words, alert to the intention behind it, alert to what you're doing, the fact that there is an intention in there someplace means that you go to an injurious place. On the other hand, if you fabricate these things in a non-injurious way, again, whether you're alert or not to what you're doing, you go to a non-injurious place. So the way we fabricate things, the way we act, the intentions we act on have huge consequences in the future. The other context he talks about is in the context of meditation. And here, he defines fabrication not as actions in general, but very specific ones. Bodily fabrication is the in and out breath. Verbal fabrication is directed thought and evaluation, the way the mind talks to itself. Mental fabrication consists of perceptions and feelings. Feelings here not so much as emotions, but rather as feeling tones of pleasure, pain, neither pleasure nor pain. Now, the way these things are defined, you can see that they don't happen only when you're meditating. It's not that you're going to do jhana and suddenly say, well, I'm going to do some directed thought and some evaluation. The mind's doing these things all the time. And then, of course, you're breathing all the time. And the mind's dealing with feelings and perceptions all the time. But the Buddha's highlighting the fact that when you're meditating, you get to see these things really clearly, especially if the breath is the topic of your meditation. You're directing your thoughts to the breath. You're evaluating the breath. Does it feel good right now? What would feel better, longer, shorter, faster, slower, deeper, more shallow, heavier, lighter? Then you try out different ways of breathing. This is a way we act in lots of different circumstances, not only when we meditate. It's simply a matter of learning how to do it with more skill and more sensitivity. As for feelings and perceptions, the feeling of pleasure that you're trying to create with the breath and the perceptions you have around the feelings, the perceptions you have around the breath, are all going to have an impact on shaping your mind. So, what you've got here is a microcosm. These are the forces that are going to shape the rest of your life and your future lifetimes as long as you're continuing to wander on. They're right here. I read a scholar talking about how these two ways of explaining the three kinds of fabrication were totally unrelated, which is missing the point. How are you going to learn about the big processes unless you look at where they come from? They come from the mind. That verse at the beginning of the Dhammapada, the mind is the forerunner of all things. Most people treat it as a nice sentiment, but they don't realize the implications. The way you shape your experience is going to determine your happiness. It's going to determine your suffering. And what do you shape it with? Bodily, verbal, and mental fabrication. These things are done in response to events from outside, and, more importantly, they go also out proactively, looking for things, shaping things. Even before you've seen sights, before you've heard sounds, your mind is already inclined to shape them in a certain way. We see this most clearly in people with very strong doctrinaire political views. Person X says something. The people who hate person X already are going to find something wrong with it, regardless of what X says. If Y says something and they like Y, then no matter how stupid Y can be, they still like him. It's because of the way they're already fabricating things before anything happens. Of course, this doesn't only happen in politics. We have certain attitudes about our feelings, our emotions. And so, when a particular emotion comes up, we ride with it, even though it may be very detrimental. This is why we create suffering, because the mind is already biased. A particular impulse comes up, and for some impulses, the way is wide open in the mind. For other impulses, there are a lot of checks and obstacles. Sometimes they have very little to do with whether the impulse is skillful or not skillful. A lot of it has to do with things we like and don't like. But then our likes are very arbitrary. Seeing them as fabricated is going to be a huge step in making it a lot easier to practice. You may hold on to a particular like, and you don't like it when people don't react well to your like. It takes a while to realize, well, maybe I shouldn't like this, or maybe I shouldn't hold on to that particular preference in this particular circumstance. This is probably one of the reasons why the Buddha focuses on suffering, because it's only when you see yourself creating suffering that you're willing to change your ways. Otherwise, you just keep banging your head and complaining about the wall being in the way, without thinking, maybe I should stop moving my head in that particular direction. But it's when you can see that you're creating the suffering, or at least willing to give that option a try, that's when you can be taught. That's why the Buddha teaches right there, at the point where you're most susceptible to maybe wanting to listen. I was reading a book on the Noble Eightfold Path a while back, where the author was saying that even the Buddha engaged in unskillful speech. Well, it turned out what this author meant by unskillful speech was saying things that people don't like. Now, there's nothing necessarily harmful about saying things that people don't like. The Buddha said, though, that you have to watch for the right time and the right place. But the idea that people's likes should be the determining factor is creating a tyranny of emotions. Just because one person doesn't like what the Buddha is saying doesn't mean that what the Buddha said was not skillful. What made it skillful was that it was 1. True, 2. Beneficial, and 3. He would choose the right time and the right place to be pleasing or displeasing. That's a much higher standard, and it's a much more livable standard. Because if we take our likes and dislikes as the measurement of the world, we'll never come to any peace. You have to step back from them and ask yourself, these things that I like, do they really lead to happiness? The things I don't like, do they really lead to suffering? Ajahn Suwat would often point out one very obvious example. We don't like suffering. We treat it as an enemy. But he said, we should learn how to treat it as a friend. Not the kind of friend where you can let down your guard, but the kind of friend you want to spend some time with to get to know this person. We take craving as our friend, and yet we should see it as our enemy. It's under the force of craving that we do all kinds of harmful things, and then we don't even admit that there was any harm done. Or if we admit that there was harm done, we didn't mean to, or we weren't responsible, or the person who was harmed doesn't matter. All kinds of ways the mind can justify harmful behavior to itself because it likes it. So we have to learn how to step back from our likes and dislikes, step back from our cravings, and the emotions that cover up the cravings. We have to really look at them and say, maybe it's time to try measuring ourselves against the Buddha's standard rather than measuring him against ours. There's a passage where the Buddha talks about the stages in going from looking for a teacher to finally gaining awakening. First, you try to find the right person. Then you learn how to listen to what that person has to say, thinking it through. And then there comes the stage which the Buddha calls measuring or putting in the balance. And basically, what that means is putting your habits and likes and dislikes in the balance against the Buddha's standards. You're willing to use his standards to measure your likes and dislikes. That's when he says you can begin to generate a desire to practice. And you find that you benefit a lot more from the Dhamma when you do. We chant Svakato Bhagavata Dhammo every night and every morning. The Blessed One's Dhamma is well taught. This is what it means. It's worthy of taking as a standard, even in areas where you don't like it. Because otherwise, we keep on fabricating in lots of unskillful ways, and we bring our preconceived notions and our prejudices and our biases and our likes and dislikes to everything that happens, everything that comes to us, and everything we go out looking for. And everything gets skewed as a result. We look at a line and it doesn't look straight. Well, Maybe it's because the glasses we're wearing have a curve, turning everything that's straight into something that's curved. Maybe it's time we took off those glasses and gave the Buddha the benefit of the doubt. After all, people for many, many centuries have been finding that, yes, the Buddha's Dhamma is well taught. Nobody chants about our likes and dislikes being well formulated. We're the only ones who think that way. It's one of the reasons why we suffer. So it's good to step back. Look at this process of fabrication. Look at the way you breathe. Look at the way you talk to yourself. Look to the feelings. In other words, feeling tones you hold on to. Look at the perceptions you hold on to. Remember these simple things that are happening right here, right now. You're engaging in them right here, right now, and they can have huge consequences. The heedful response, and the response that has goodwill for yourself and those around you, is to decide that you want to do these things skillfully, taking the Buddha's standards for what counts as skillful as your measurement. At the very least, give it a try. Fueled by intention. The Buddha's main impersonal teaching takes the general principle of this that conditionality and works it out in detail in terms of specific events. It's called dependent co-arising. This is his explanation of how actions and events in your immediate experience arise together with the causes, also in your immediate experience, upon which they depend. In its most basic form, this teaching lists a sequence of causal factors, starting with events in the mind and ending with suffering. It's an explanation of how suffering involves, step by step, many specific mental actions working together. The canon contains several different versions of the sequence of causes. The differences among these versions can be explained by the fact that even though the general outlines of how suffering happens are the same for everyone, the specifics vary for each person and for particular instances of suffering. The differences also come from the complexity of this that conditionality itself, with its potential for many different feedback loops. One important feature that all the lists have in common is that they play out on many levels and in many time frames, across many lifetimes, or from moment to moment in the mind. In line with this that conditionality, an instance of suffering you experience right now can be the result of something you did either right now or lifetimes ago, or a combination of the two. The sequence of events can occur in the flash of an eye or over eons. Each of the lists is long, but as the canon points out, it's not necessary to know an entire list. In practice, all you have to do is to bring knowledge to a particular causal connection. Knowledge of what it is, how it's caused, how it ceases, and the path of practice leading to its cessation. That severs that particular connection, which in turn brings the entire causal sequence leading to suffering to an end. MN 9, SN 312. So first we'll focus on the factors dealing directly with karma and its results. One of the distinctive features of every formulation of dependent co-arising is the large number of factors occurring prior to input at the six senses. Even before you see a sight or hear a sound, activities in the mind that occur in ignorance can already prime you to suffer, even if the sight or sound is pleasant. The standard description, SN 12.2, places these prior factors in this order: ignorance, fabrications, acts of constructing intentions, consciousness at the six senses, name and form, mental acts and physical properties, and the six sense media. For our purposes here, we don't need to understand the entire list. We can focus just on the factors dealing with karma past and present. Start with the six sense media. These, as we've noted, should be seen as the results of old karma. Then, as you work back through the list from there, you find two factors that deal explicitly with intention in the present moment. Your present moment karma, name and form on the one hand and fabrications on the other. Because the six sense media come after fabrication and name and form in the list of factors, This means that you experience your new karma in the present even before you experience the results of your old karma. Examples of this fact are very common. You approach a situation with ideas of what you want to get out of it even before you've encountered it. Or your palette of preconceived notions, political, religious, social, colors what you'll see even before you see it. What's radical about the Buddha's teaching here is in saying that your experience of old karma, the six senses, is totally dependent on present karma. Therein lies hope. If your new karma is done in ignorance, it'll prime you to suffer from the results of old karma, no matter how good your old karma was. But if it's done with knowledge, it can prime you in the other direction, towards suffering's end, regardless of how bad your old karma might have been. If there is no present moment karma at all, there's no grounding for any experience of the six senses. That frees the mind to experience a dimension apart from the six senses. As we'll see, that's not a location, but it's how suffering ceases. Another distinctive feature of how present moment intention is treated in dependent co-arising is that it always appears in factors that are composed of clusters of physical and mental events. This means that many physical and mental events can have an immediate effect on your intentions, and vice versa. This opens the possibility for very fast feedback loops of cause and effect in the mind. Consider first how intention appears in the factor of name and form, or mental and physical events, as one of the sub-factors of name. There it's clustered with feeling, perception, attention, and contact. Feeling here means feeling tones of pleasure, pain, or neither pleasure nor pain. Perceptions are mental labels, images or individual words that identify what something is, what it means, or what it's worth. An example of all three aspects of perception would be when you come to a red light at an intersection. You perceive the light as red. You perceive that it means stop, and you perceive it as worth obeying. Attention is the act of focusing on what you regard as important or interesting, and ignoring what you regard as not. As the Buddha explains the act of attention, he notes that it's often a matter of focusing on the questions you want to see answered and ignoring the ones whose answers don't interest you. MN2. Contact in this context means contact among events in the mind, as when a perception or feeling influences an intention, or when you pay attention to one perception rather than to another. It's because of contact among these mental events that feedback loops in the mind can happen very quickly. For instance, you can give rise to an unskillful intention. It produces a mental feeling of pain. You generate a perception as to why the feeling has occurred, and you intend to do something about it. This allows you to correct for your unskillful actions if you're paying proper attention. An example would be when you feel anger and give rise to a split-second intention to say something hurtful to someone you love. That intention causes a twinge of pain. You pay attention to what you're doing and immediately perceive that the pain is connected to the intention. So now you formulate a new intention to abandon the original one. This is how you can self-correct. However, the process also has plenty of room for compounding an unskillful action, as when you aren't paying attention to what you're doing, or you perceive the cause of the pain as something other than the original intention. For instance, you can easily blame your mental pain on the person you're angry at, and this fortifies the intention to do harm. This is how the mind spirals out of control. The possibility for error explains why our desires can often be deluded, but the possibility for giving rise to new, more accurate perceptions and acts of attention explains why we can correct our ways. As we'll see, it's precisely this possibility that the Buddha exploits when he teaches people to bring knowledge to the acts of their minds. Now consider the second location in which intention occurs prior to sensory contact, even earlier in the sequence, prior to the factor of name and form. That's the factor of fabrication, which is placed at the beginning of the causal sequence right after ignorance. Fabrication is sometimes treated as a synonym for intention, SN 2256. Sometimes it's explained as assembling mental and physical phenomena for the sake of a purpose, SN 2279. The Pali term for fabrication, Saṅkhāra, literally means putting together. It's the creative, purposeful function of the mind. The canon classifies many types of fabrications, but in the context of dependent co-arising, the focus is on three: bodily, verbal, and mental. These three fabrications occur on two levels of scale: macro and micro. On the macro level, in the world at large, the word fabrications denotes any intentional bodily, verbal, or mental actions that lead to good or bad levels of rebirth, AN 4, 237. On the micro level, in your experience of the body and mind as you feel them from within in the present, bodily fabrication denotes the in and out breath. Verbal fabrication denotes the way you talk to yourself. This the canon divides into two processes: directed thought, where you choose a topic to talk about, and evaluation, where you examine the topic, ask questions about it, or make comments on it. Finally, mental fabrication denotes feelings and perceptions, which we've already encountered under name, above MN 44. The macro level of fabrication comes from the micro level. Without the in and out breath, you couldn't engage in any bodily action. Without talking to yourself, you couldn't break into speech. And without feelings and perceptions, you couldn't engage in other mental activities. This, as we'll see, is why meditation focused on these micro-level fabrications in the present moment can have an impact not only now, but also far into the future. You're focusing directly on karma right as it begins. That puts you in a good place, as you meditate, to send it in the right direction from the very start. Also note that even though feeling and perception appear both under fabrication and name, they play different roles in relation to intention in the two contexts. Under name, feeling and perception are mental events that can have an influence on intention and can be influenced by it. Under fabrications, though, the fact that feeling and perception are listed as fabrications means that they inherently contain an intentional element right within them. Not only can intention influence them, its influence is part and parcel of how they come to be. Without intention, you wouldn't experience feeling and perception at all. This point, in fact, applies to all five of the objects that Sariputta, in his imagined dialogue with people in foreign lands, listed as the objects of desire and passion: form, feeling, perception, fabrications, and consciousness. Not only do we feel desire and passion for these aggregates, but our desire and passion for fabricating them also plays an important role in bringing them into being in the present moment, SN 2279. It actualizes the potentials for these things coming in from old karma. The present moment is a construction site fueled by intention. Because it's perpetually under construction, it's not a place where you can find unending peace. And as long as the intentions responsible for constructing things in the present are influenced by ignorance, those constructions will collapse on us, either right away or over time, making us suffer. Or you can make a comparison to cooking. Your past karma provides the raw food that your present intentions put into a form that you can actually feed on. If your present moment skills are meager, if you know only how to put your food into a fire, for instance, you can make yourself a miserable meal even if the ingredients in your pantry today are good. But if you have a wide variety of skills, if you bring knowledge and skill to your present moment fabrications and acts of intention, you can make a good meal even out of ingredients that are bad. As we'll see, the Buddha focuses a lot of attention on developing precisely these skills. The shorter set of questions and answers, Kula Vedala Sutta, MN 44. The Buddha praised Dhammadina the nun as the foremost Dhamma teacher among his nun disciples. In this discourse, she answers questions put to her by a layman, Visakha, who, according to the commentary, was her former husband, a merchant of Rajagaha and a non-returner. I have heard that on one occasion the Blessed One was staying near Rajagaha in the bamboo forest, the squirrel's sanctuary. Then Visakha, the lay follower, went to Dhammadina, the nun, and, on arrival, having bowed down to her, sat to one side. Self-identification. As he was sitting there, he said to her, "Self-identification, self-identification," it is said, lady. Which self-identification is described by the Blessed One? There are these 5 clinging aggregates, friend Visakha: the form clinging aggregate, the feeling clinging aggregate, the perception clinging aggregate, the fabrications clinging aggregate, the consciousness clinging aggregate. These 5 clinging aggregates are the self-identification described by the Blessed One, saying, "Yes, lady." Visakha, the lay follower, delighted and rejoiced in what Dhammadina the nun had said. Then he asked her a further question. The origination of self-identification. The origination of self-identification, it is said, lady. Which origination of self-identification is described by the Blessed One? The craving that makes for further becoming, accompanied by passion and delight, relishing now here and now there, that is, craving for sensual pleasure, craving for becoming, craving for non-becoming. This, friend Visakha, is the origination of self-identification described by the Blessed One. The cessation of self-identification, the cessation of self-identification, it is said, lady. Which cessation of self-identification is described by the Blessed One? The remainderless fading and cessation, renunciation, relinquishment, release, and letting go of that very craving. This, friend Visakha, is the cessation of self-identification described by the Blessed One. The way of practice leading to the cessation of self-identification, the way of practice leading to the cessation of self-identification, it is said, lady. Which way of practice leading to the cessation of self-identification is described by the Blessed One? Precisely this noble eightfold path: right view, right resolve, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. This, friend Visakha, is the way of practice leading to the cessation of self-identification described by the Blessed One. Is it the case, lady, that clinging is the same thing as the 5 clinging aggregates, or is it something separate? Friend Visakha, neither is clinging the same thing as the 5 clinging aggregates, nor is it something separate. Whatever desire and passion there is with regard to the 5 clinging aggregates, that is the clinging there. But lady, how does self-identification view come about? There is the case, friend Visakha, where an uninstructed run-of-the-mill person who has no regard for noble ones is not well-versed or disciplined in their Dhamma, who has no regard for people of integrity, is not well-versed or disciplined in their Dhamma, assumes form, for example, the body to be the self, or the self as possessing form, or form as in the self, or the self as in form. He assumes feeling to be the self. He assumes perception to be the self. He assumes fabrications to be the self. He assumes consciousness to be the self, or the self as possessing consciousness, or consciousness as in the self, or the self as in consciousness. This is how self-identification view comes about. But lady, how does self-identification view not come about? There is the case where a well-instructed disciple of the noble ones, who has regard for noble ones, is well-versed and disciplined in their Dhamma, who has regard for people of integrity, is well-versed and disciplined in their Dhamma, doesn't assume form to be the self, or the self as possessing form, or form as in the self, or the self as in form. He doesn't assume feeling to be the self. He doesn't assume perception to be the self. He doesn't assume fabrications to be the self. He doesn't assume consciousness to be the self, or the self as possessing consciousness, or consciousness as in the self, or the self as in consciousness. This is how self-identification view does not come about. The Noble Eightfold Path. Now again, lady, what is the Noble Eightfold Path? This is the Noble Eightfold Path, friend Visakha. Right view, right resolve, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. Is the Noble Eightfold Path fabricated or unfabricated? The Noble Eightfold Path is fabricated. And are the three aggregates of virtue, concentration, and discernment included under the Noble Eightfold Path, lady? Or is the Noble Eightfold Path included under the three aggregates? The three aggregates are not included under the Noble Eightfold Path, friend Visakha, but the Noble Eightfold Path is included under the three aggregates. Right speech, right action, and right livelihood come under the aggregate of virtue. Right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration come under the aggregate of concentration. Right view and right resolve come under the aggregate of discernment. Now, what is concentration, lady? What qualities are its themes? What qualities are its requisites? And what is its development? Singleness of mind is concentration, friend Visakha. The four establishings of mindfulness are its themes. The four right exertions are its requisites, and any cultivation, development, and pursuit of these qualities is its development. Fabrications. Now, lady, what are fabrications? These three fabrications, friend Visakha, bodily fabrications, verbal fabrications, and mental fabrications. But what are bodily fabrications? What are verbal fabrications? What are mental fabrications? In and out breaths are bodily fabrications. Directed thought and evaluation are verbal fabrications. Perceptions and feelings are mental fabrications. But why are in and out breaths bodily fabrications? Why are directed thought and evaluation verbal fabrications? Why are perceptions and feelings mental fabrications? In and out breaths are bodily. These are things tied up with the body. That's why in and out breaths are bodily fabrications. Having first directed one's thoughts and made an evaluation, one then breaks out into speech. That's why directed thought and evaluation are verbal fabrications. Perceptions and feelings are mental. These are things tied up with the mind. That's why perceptions and feelings are mental fabrications. Now, lady, how does the attainment of the cessation of perception and feeling come about? The thought does not occur to a monk as he is attaining the cessation of perception and feeling that I am about to attain the cessation of perception and feeling, or that I am attaining the cessation of perception and feeling, or that I have attained the cessation of perception and feeling. Instead, the way his mind has previously been developed leads him to that state. But when a monk is attaining the cessation of perception and feeling, which things cease first? Bodily fabrications, verbal fabrications, or mental fabrications? When a monk is attaining the cessation of perception and feeling, friend Visakha, verbal fabrications cease first, then bodily fabrications, then mental fabrications. 1. Now, lady, how does emergence from the cessation of perception and feeling come about? The thought does not occur to a monk as he is emerging from the cessation of perception and feeling that I am about to emerge from the cessation of perception and feeling, or that I am emerging from the cessation of perception and feeling, or that I have emerged from the cessation of perception and feeling. Instead, the way his mind has previously been developed leads him to that state. But when a monk is emerging from the cessation of perception and feeling, which things arise first? Bodily fabrications, verbal fabrications, or mental fabrications? When a monk is emerging from the cessation of perception and feeling, friend Visakha, mental fabrications arise first, then bodily fabrications, then verbal fabrications. When a monk has emerged from the cessation of perception and feeling, lady, how many contacts make contact? When a monk has emerged from the cessation of perception and feeling, friend Visakha, 3 contacts make contact. Contact with emptiness, contact with the themeless, and contact with the undirected. 2. When a monk has emerged from the cessation of perception and feeling, lady, to what does his mind lean? To what does it tend? To what does it incline? When a monk has emerged from the cessation of perception and feeling, friend Visakha, his mind leans to seclusion, tends to seclusion, inclines to seclusion. Feeling. Now, lady, how many kinds of feeling are there? These 3 kinds of feeling: pleasant feeling, painful feeling, and neither pleasant nor painful feeling. What is pleasant feeling? What is painful feeling? What is neither pleasant nor painful feeling? Whatever is experienced physically or mentally as pleasant and gratifying is pleasant feeling. Whatever is experienced physically or mentally as painful and hurting is painful feeling. Whatever is experienced physically or mentally as neither gratifying nor hurting is neither pleasant nor painful feeling. In what way is pleasant feeling pleasant, lady? And in what way painful? In what way is painful feeling painful? And in what way pleasant? In what way is neither pleasant nor painful feeling pleasant? And in what way painful? Pleasant feeling is pleasant in remaining and painful in changing, friend Visakha. Painful feeling is painful in remaining and pleasant in changing. Neither pleasant nor painful feeling is pleasant in occurring together with knowledge, and painful in occurring without knowledge. What obsession gets obsessed with pleasant feeling? What obsession gets obsessed with painful feeling? What obsession gets obsessed with neither pleasant nor painful feeling? Passion obsession gets obsessed with pleasant feeling. Resistance obsession gets obsessed with painful feeling. Ignorance obsession gets obsessed with neither pleasant nor painful feeling. Does passion obsession get obsessed with all pleasant feeling? Does resistance obsession get obsessed with all painful feeling? Does ignorance obsession get obsessed with all neither pleasant nor painful feeling? No. But what is to be abandoned with regard to pleasant feeling? What is to be abandoned with regard to painful feeling? What is to be abandoned with regard to neither pleasant nor painful feeling? Passion obsession is to be abandoned with regard to pleasant feeling. Resistance obsession is to be abandoned with regard to painful feeling. Ignorance obsession is to be abandoned with regard to neither pleasant nor painful feeling. Is passion obsession to be abandoned with regard to all pleasant feeling? Is resistance obsession to be abandoned with regard to all painful feeling? Is ignorance obsession to be abandoned with regard to all neither pleasant nor painful feeling? No. There is the case where a monk, quite secluded from sensuality, secluded from unskillful qualities, enters and remains in the first jhana, rapture and pleasure born of seclusion, accompanied by directed thought and evaluation. With that he abandons passion. No passion obsession gets obsessed there. 4. There is the case where a monk considers, "Oh, when will I enter and remain in the dimension that those who are noble now enter and remain in?" And as he thus nurses this yearning for the unexcelled liberations, there arises within him sorrow based on that yearning. With that, he abandons resistance. No resistance obsession gets obsessed there. 5. There is the case where a monk, with the abandoning of pleasure and pain, as with the earlier disappearance of elation and distress, enters and remains in the fourth jhana. Purity of equanimity and mindfulness, neither pleasure nor pain. With that he abandons ignorance. No ignorance obsession gets obsessed there. 6. Now what, lady, lies on the other side of pleasant feeling? Passion lies on the other side of pleasant feeling. And what lies on the other side of painful feeling? Resistance lies on the other side of painful feeling. 7. What lies on the other side of neither pleasant nor painful feeling? Ignorance lies on the other side of neither pleasant nor painful feeling. What lies on the other side of ignorance? Clear knowing lies on the other side of ignorance. What lies on the other side of clear knowing? Release lies on the other side of clear knowing. What lies on the other side of release? Unbinding lies on the other side of release. What lies on the other side of unbinding? You've gone too far, friend Visakha. You can't keep holding on up to the limit of questions. For the holy life gains a footing in unbinding, culminates in unbinding, has unbinding as its final end. If you wish, go to the Blessed One and ask him the meaning of these things. Whatever he says, that's how you should remember it. Then Visakha, the lay follower, delighting and rejoicing in what Dhammadinna the nun had said, bowed down to her, and keeping her to his right, went to the Blessed One. On arrival, having bowed down to the Blessed One, he sat to one side. As he was sitting there, he told the Blessed One the full extent of the conversation he had had with Dhammadinna the nun. When this was said, the Blessed One said to him, Dhammadinna the nun is wise, Visakha, a woman of great discernment. If you had asked me those things, I would have answered you in the same way she did. That is the meaning of those things. That is how you should remember it. That is what the Blessed One said. Gratified, Visakha the lay follower delighted in the Blessed One's words.